Welcome to the Beyond Pain podcast with your host, Joe Gambino and Joe LaVacca. Join the two Joes, two physical therapists, as they discuss how to navigate the uncertainties of pain so you can move beyond it and get back to the activities you love most. This podcast is for Joe, and their guests to share their clinical thoughts and ideas based on their collective clinical experiences. Can this information be for you? Maybe, but we cannot know for sure. Therefore, it is always worth talking to your healthcare provider to make the best decisions in your care before you implement anything on this podcast. And please use common sense. Welcome back in to another episode of the Beyond Pain podcast. I am one of your hosts, Joe Gambino, and I am here with our other host, Joe LaVacca. You can find us both on Instagram, myself at Joe Gambino DPT, and LaVacca over there at Strength and Motion _PT. This podcast is on Instagram, Beyond Pain Podcast, and on YouTube, Cups of Joe _PT. Welcome back, Joe Boy.
It is good to be back. And I almost forgot to bring up something I wanted to ask you about. And this has got to be on everybody's mind because it's buzzing. What about that astronomer CEO and HR chief of staff at the Coldplay? They got cold played. I've heard a new verb when you're exposed at a concert. Or exposed at the least likely time you ever expected. You got cold played. So yeah, he came out. He was like, sort of like almost like pushing back a little bit. Like, yeah, I did something wrong, but Coldplay shouldn't be pushing or putting people up on the jumbotron, which is like one of the reasons you go to a concert or a game. You want to go up on the jumbotron. And I remember last year when Courtney, Avery, and Addison came out, we took them to a Met game. Right, because I like Citi Field more than I like Yankee Stadium. Kill me. It's so much easier for me to get to being out on Long Island than it is to work my way up to the Bronx. Whatever. Diehard Yankee fan, prefer to go to Met games. This is what it is, right? So Avery was like, it was June, right? And Addison was going to be here. She's already off from school, and Avery was like, hey, can I stay home from school tomorrow because Addison's here? And I was like, well, there's no real reason. You have like a half day or something. It's a couple hours. Addison's probably going to be sleeping. And she's like, oh, come on. Like, we want to hang out. We don't get to see each other. She played the card. And I was like, I tell you what, you get on the Jumbotron and you can stay home tomorrow. Wouldn't you know it? Her, Addison, Courtney got on the Jumbotron twice. And I think it was my sleeve that made it both times. I was like, the hell? So, they were all excited. They were jumping around dancing. So what are your thoughts? Does he have a case? Should we be blasting people up, putting their lives out there on jumbotrons? Should we be assuming they're married couples?
I think if you are doing something like that and you go to a public venue where that cameras are there, it's kind of on you at that point. Like, make better decisions. Yeah. I don't know what's worse. When I'm watching that, like in the reaction, I understand like you feel guilty in the moment, but like it looks so much worse when like you're just like, let me duck.
Yeah. Honestly, like if they would have just waved and been like, oh my God, hey, no one would have asked who they were. Like the affair would have been like completely fine, right? It would have just been like, oh, look at them, they're so cute. All they had to do was wave. But the fact that their faces melt, and his face, he just like looked down and started melting.
Like literally, you probably like crawled or on the floor to get somewhere. I was like, man, you just make it look so bad.
Yeah, I know, man. It's so funny. And like honestly, but like you said, like you're literally on the rail in your box. Like you're not like hugging in the back or whatever. Like you're like front row. Like there's for some reason it was like not even anybody around them, which I would expect at a Coldplay concert. To be honest, lots of seats, if you know what I mean. I'm just kidding, Chris. Don't put my life on blast at all. But really,
now that's it.
Really. Yeah, really interesting. People's behaviors are very fascinating. We've talked about behaviors, so a little segue for us. There's nothing connected to what we're talking about.
Our topic on shoulder pain and bench pressing. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, I know. It just popped into my mind. I know we didn't talk about it, but so today we're going to talk a little bit about shoulder pain and bench pressing. When you're working with any group of active athletes with shoulder pain, they are doing some sort of press, whether it's a push-up, a bench press, you name it. So why don't we start at the top? We have someone come in to see us. What are your first couple of assessments or things that you want to look at with people virtually, especially, that we can kind of talk about and discuss to maybe kind of dig a little deeper into why their shoulder is hurting when it comes to the bench press or these pressing type motions?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think it really kind of depends on symptoms and stuff like that. But typically the main things that I'm starting to look at is like what are the motions that happen at the bench press, and the big ones are you have some horizontal abduction there. You do get into some extension. There's internal rotation, right? So I want to
Mm-hmm.
break down those things and see how those things are from a mobility perspective. Do any of those things recreate their symptoms? And then what happens when we add some load to them? The same thing, right? How well can those tissues tolerate load? If all those things are clear, then it's likely just going to be some overtraining, so to speak. So then I'm going to look at the movement, or load them in different ways to see what else might recreate their pain. Little things like that, and test the joint, the AC joint, little stuff around there. But the big ones I'm going to initially look at are going to be those like how well can they extend, how well can they internally rotate with the arm at 90 degrees of abduction there, so straight out to the side, and then can they like even just reach back and load that tissue overall, and then I may look up at the neck depending on their symptoms and stuff like that.
Yeah, I like that. The extension one is interesting, right? Because there's been so many times by just looking at extension asymmetry that I've been able to help someone problem solve their shoulder pain with the bench. And it seems sort of like innocuous, and it's not something that immediately comes up, but breaking down these little pieces and then going into your test and retest is sort of like the process that we have, or the best process that we have from assessment and treatment standpoint, right? It's like, hey, we know pain is complex. We know movement is complex. This seems a little off. What happens if we gave you a better shoulder in this capacity? Does that allow you to express yourself in something very complicated like a bench press? So I think that the range of motion discussion, much like our discussion when we mentioned about programming and peaking and the 10% rule, is there a range of motion asymmetry that you're looking for, or that you have a hard cutoff? And I know you can't measure like degree for degree virtually, but are you, when you're eyeballing, keeping a 10% rule in mind of a difference, a 20% rule in mind? Is it just like pain, or what's your screening process?
Yeah. I mean, if there's no pain, I mean, I'm probably not going to really. I mean, like maybe if I'm seeing like, okay, like this person doesn't have a lot of internal rotation, we're just going to work on those things because that's just going to build a healthier shoulder overall and give them better tools for bench press and stuff like that. But yeah, if someone has pain, and then I'm also seeing these things, and I'm going to start to address whatever's being found there. And even if it's not like, I don't know, I never really put like, oh, if it's more than a 10% difference, I'm going to look at it, and I think it comes down to pre-test, post-testing, and what happens when we start to do things, and what happens to how they feel afterwards, and does that change the move quality or how well they can do something? Then those things start to really make sense. Oh, well, we worked on internal rotation, and we were strengthening their end range for this, and we worked on some repeated motions into extension, and then all of a sudden they were able to get at the bottom of their bench with 95 pounds, way better than before, right? Like, okay, well, that's really clear that then this tissue should continue to be worked on to some capacity, because then those adaptations will happen, and it will allow them to get at least start to even use the bench as a rehab exercise. Oh, maybe you can bench 200, but now you can do 95 pounds now. Let's load that tissue. Maybe we can do some like 1.5 reps and spend some more time at the bottom of that position, or partial reps and really just focus on that eccentric portion, right? So we can load those tissues and make them stronger. I think it really depends. And then obviously, if you're messing with the shoulder, nothing happens. I mean, you can get referral pain from the neck, right? So then you're going to probably want to go up and clear the neck and see if there's any nerve tension, to see what's kind of going on up there. If any, again, when you do something, test post-testing, sometimes you can do it maybe too much where you get in the client's head, but I'm always doing these tests to see, okay, these things make things worse, these things make things feel better, and that starts to allow me to figure out, okay, this is going to be the plan of action for the movements that are going to be put to this plan, how we're going to back off training, what modifications are we going to make, little things like that.
Yeah, I think no hard set in terms of like ratio difference of range of motion. I know, having taken similar courses, following similar people, the 10%, 10 degree, maybe just sort of like idea always pops up. I think for me, it's going to be a little bit more of, is it someone like you and I who is recreationally lifting? Well, yeah, if you have a 10% difference in your range of motion, it's maybe not as big of a deal. If you're more in the professional level where you're doing this over and over again, or a competition level, hey, then maybe I want to give you a little bit more of a framework where I want that to button up a little bit, only because you're going to be asking your shoulder to do a lot more than you and I ask our shoulder to do, or just sort of like, a person who works a 9 to 5 job, has a family, just doing a couple sets of push pull during the course of the week. So I think there's a sort of a frame or a screen that I'll think about there is how nitpicky do I want to get with this person? But I always kind of put it on our little whiteboard and with the explanation of, hey, look, this is a difference we're seeing side to side. This is a difference that we're seeing on the side that's painful, right? This could be a protection behavior, but if we can start to train this and, put it on the shelf, put it on the idea, along with that test and retest sort of like screening process that we go through with everyone, either during a session or week to week or month to month. As this improves, does your shoulder pain improve? As this improves, does your numbers on the bench go back up? But I also find that one of the other big like little screens that I've thrown in, especially since taking the dynamometer course, is just sort of like a quick screen of like external rotation strength or posterior shoulder strength. And when we look at sort of like some of these EMG studies, not that I live and die by these EMG studies, but it is helpful to know on certain movements which muscles are taking a little bit more force. And with a pressing motion, the posterior aspect of your rotator cuff or posterior aspect of your shoulder girdle is working a little bit harder than some of the front muscles. So we have to create that nice stable platform back there so that way we can exert force. It's sort of like those cannons shooting off of a big ship, right? The ship maybe being the scapula. So if we can assess that, oftentimes I'll find that even kind of helping people work through some of their posterior shoulder strength, but making it real. So the simplest test is usually a side-lying external rotation test. Hey, I'll take maybe 5% of their body weight, something that's pretty light. Go to that non-painful side. Hey, give me as many reps as you can with this, and maybe 5% even is too much for some people. And then they're really like, oh my God, I bench press 350 pounds and I can't, do a side-lying external rotation with 3 pounds even on my good side, because those muscles do get fatigued pretty quickly. So I have them doing it on the right side. And then with that same weight, all right, let's go after the left side. And more often than not, people are burning up, they're fatiguing way sooner. So again, like not to say that if we just magically fix that, all their pain will go away, but it does create that kind of buy-in of like, wow, I didn't know that was there. And then I'll often do that with like a maybe even like a rear delt fly too, just one arm at a time. Same thing, like 2 to 5% of body weight. Hey, just give me as many as you can on this side. Stop when you feel burning or fatigue, and then we're going to chase that on the other side. So is that like any, like, again, virtually, I know it's probably going to be a little bit different depending on where your client is, but do you have them do any plank tests, grip tests, or anything like that as part of this screen?
I don't do grip. I don't have a down, like a way to test those things, but I have done, like I'll look at like, okay, I can see, if I'm going to go for the, more scapular stuff, right, I'm going to look at quality of movement as far as overhead movement goes. Whenever they're moving the shoulder, like, is their scapula doing what we would expect it to do? I will do, the side lot, have them do load external rotation. See someone who has a shoulder issue. It was exactly what you described, right? Like, okay, let's on his, he had limited external rotation on that side. On the impaired side, he had a hard time reaching across his body, some pain within his golf swing. And then when we actually just try to like load external rotation, like I think he could only do like 5 or 6 reps with like 3 pounds before his shoulder was like super fatigued, right? Like, okay, well, like, we started working on those things. So, it just comes down, we look at mobility, I look at strength, I look at, how the scapula kind of works, I'll look at some of the joints around it. And then based off of all that stuff, it's, whatever pops up. And then, sound like a broken record here, but then, it just comes down to what kind of things make, like when we were doing those tests and we started doing, like I started working on external rotation with that person, all of a sudden, like reaching across his body got better. He has some pain up here and like, all of a sudden that got better. Like, so you're seeing those things. We're not just blindly saying, oh, because we saw this with one person, well, now it goes to everybody. But like, I want to be able to see that when we do this, there's a change. Sometimes you do get these people where you do everything or you test everything and there are no changes. And I think those people who are slower responders, and then you just have to start with the process and see how that kind of goes and let time kind of dictate a little bit. But more often than not, you should see some sort of change with something. And then I lean into that very, very heavily.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, we've said this before too, that people usually are not necessarily starting their journey with you and I. They've seen a few other people. Maybe they have been working on their internal rotation. Maybe they have been working on this like external rotation. And then I'm always fascinated by this question because then I'll typically just ask them, well, has anybody watched you bench?
Mm-hmm.
No, because my other PT office didn't have a barbell. They didn't have a bench. They didn't have enough weight. They only had these dumbbells and these kettlebells and these bands. So I couldn't show them. So I think like with something like a squat, a deadlift, and a bench press, as we are conditioning tissues and whatever that means, working on mobility, um, you know, working on conditioning endurance, conditioning strength to some degree. The cool thing is that we don't necessarily need one specific marker to help people with shoulder pain get better. And a lot of times these markers don't improve, but their shoulder pain improves, which is kind of cool. So then I think it's sort of at that point, hey, what about technique? And how do you coach technique when it comes to the bench press to help people out?
Yeah, and another thing that people don't actually realize is that the bench press is probably arguably more technical than squat or deadlift, right? It's people are like, oh, squat and deadlift, they would think it's the least, right? But it requires the most amount of technical work. And the way I do, I mean, a lot of people just send me videos, right? I want to be able to see it mostly from the side, so I can see like, wrist position. Is it over the elbow? Like where their bar path is looking like, right? Is it going like towards their feet or a little bit towards their head or straight up? What are they actually like pulling their scapulars into retraction? Are they getting some good spine extension in there, right? Because the whole setup there is meant to give you as much like passive support as possible, so you can create the strength through the motion. Which is why some of these powerlifters, you'll see that if they have the mobility, right, they're going to take these huge arcs and they're going to shorten their range of motion, and it's going to give them a lot of benefit when they're trying to actually, be strong. So I'll take those things, and then I talked about this in the episode. We talked about technology, but then I will have their video on my screen. I will have a Zoom recording going, and I will have their video there, and I'm going to be walking them through. This is what I'm seeing here. This is what we need to change. And I only make one or two changes every time I'm coaching somebody, because if I gave somebody 10 different cues there, and this is the same thing in person, they're not going to be able to process it all. So I take the one that I feel is the biggest. We're going to work through that one and then make that change. So I definitely think getting your eyes on technique can make a big difference. And then also modifications. I mean, like what happens a lot of times with people who struggle with the internal rotation, if you incline them, it's going to be easier on their shoulders. What happens when you bring them to dumbbells versus barbell and you're not on such a fixed path? That stuff will also give you information as far as like, well, okay, you can train this stuff now or work through this stuff. So go get your training response. And then we can start working on how can we start to kind of build it up and get you back to bench. And sometimes it's just playing around with grip. I mean, like for me, for a while, bench press was bothering my neck. I went to slightly wider grip and it felt like ridiculously better.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this is great. So I think sometimes same thing with like the squat, right? Like we always talk about foot position. Same thing with bench. Same thing with deadlifts. Like you can make these minor changes to where your hand positions are and see how that feels as well to help you out.
Yeah, I think you definitely hit on a couple things there. And people, I think, are always really fascinated by like again that like scap retracted, spinal extended position. Because they're kind of thinking I want to be flat and I want to reach my way through my bench press, and I'm like, well, that's not going to really be a pretty powerful position for you, or a position where you have a lot of leverage when you're putting that much weight on yourself. So there's a lot of aha moments when we go through technique. Wrist position is always one of them too, because people are like always trying to keep their wrists in neutral rather than letting them extend just a little bit. So we take all these ideas from other places that we're taught, especially in PT, and then we're trying to apply them in all of these joints and all these different positions, and they just don't work like that.
Yeah.
So, this is where I think having some of that knowledge in the powerlifting space that, hey, look, if you want to go wider, you can. You could also have one wider if your shoulder, again, feels more comfortable that way. And we're talking about limitations in extension or internal rotation, right? So, yeah, play with that. And that's another thing. People are like, oh, I thought my hands had to be in the same position. I thought my feet had to be in the same position. I thought this had to be in the same position. I'm like, no. So, you just give them permission to move in what feels more comfortable with those one or two techniques. And if you don't get the result you're looking for, then just go to the next one. Or what I've kind of done is, just ask people of like, hey, look, if we're seeing, these couple of opportunities, which one to you makes the most sense? Which one do you think that you can easily correct? And then we'll just start from there. And whatever the client, oh, well, I can definitely just open up my grip a little bit. Cool. Then you don't do everything exactly the same that you just did. Just open up your grip, see if that helps, right? And then if they're still struggling, that's when I'll say, all right, cool. You picked all these couple things. What I would have picked number one would have probably been that spinal position or that wrist position. So what if we come back and we just think about that one thing now? Does that make a difference? And then, again, maybe it's just trial and error. Maybe it's just some more repetitions. But yeah, we can definitely obviously change the way force is moving through tissue. If we can change that, maybe we change some perception, we can lower some pain, and then that, kind of starts these muscles coordinating again a little bit more. And that's really what we're looking for to then, build them back up.
And I think, when we're looking, we're both not very biomechanical, but we're looking at like bench, squat, deadlift, and performance, right? Like biomechanics really matters, right? Because you want the path of least resistance. You want to be able to use forces appropriately. And if you bring the bar too low or too high, or the bar isn't going in that like J shape on the way up, well, then you're going to be working harder than you have to, right? And that's going to limit the amount of weight that's actually going to be pushed on the bar, right? So it becomes that's why it becomes very technical, right? But otherwise, that's why we do this retractive position and we have the spine extended. Sure, it's not the most functional, right? But if your goal is to have a bigger bench or to have no pain in the bench and move efficiently, we're not training for function there, right? We're trying to be better at this exercise, right? And I think those are two very, very different things. And then you use your accessory work and your other training in your program to create that, right? Like, okay, well, we need to work on protraction. So with rows, that's a common place where I'll stick that is at the bottom of your row, you're going to let your shoulder get all the way into protraction so you can work through a full range of motion. I'm not going to do that on the bench press, so to speak. So a couple nuances there.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, I think that's a lot to take in, right? I mean, we talked about range of motion asymmetry. We talked about posterior shoulder work. We're talking about scale now. We have a couple of really good guests, I think, coming up for the podcast that I think can maybe even lend more of an ear here in the coming weeks. So everyone stay tuned for that. We're pretty pumped about these guests. Anything else that you think is a pearl of wisdom for people experiencing pain with the bench press, Mr. Gambino?
No, I think we recapped it well, and I think it just comes down to making sure that you have the movement tools to be able to do so, that you are working on the rotator cuff strength and making sure scapula has mobility as well and stability, and that you're also making sure that you're modifying accordingly to make sure that you're not just constantly pissing off the tissue just because you want to be able to bench. I found a lot of success by just pulling something out and plugging something in its place that's not painful, working on a couple of other things, and then slowly reintegrating the movement that you want to get back in. I mean, that's honestly what I think 90% of people miss. It's like that. It's that simple.
Exactly, man. Amen. And then, I always like to tell people, if you're striking out and you can't press, just pull a little bit more. And that's how I'll leave it. Any other things, Mr. Gambino?
Nope. Take us home.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you again for joining us for another episode. Joe, we love you. Listeners, we love you. And don't forget to tune in next week where we keep pressing forward on the Beyond Pain podcast.
I see what you did there, Joe.